Well, Ryan Stoa is an associate professor of law at Concordia University School of Law, and that's in Idaho. Now, we are here in Colorado. Many of you may not be from Colorado, but those of you who are probably familiar with cannabis and hemp because, of course, Colorado made headlines. January 1st, 2014, I remember that day doing the news that morning on KGNU because it was the morning that we had the first recreational marijuana shops, or dispensaries as they're called, opening up. And there were camera crews from Japan and Australia and New Zealand, all around the world, coming to look at this great experiment that was Colorado. And since then, we've seen many, many states lift the federal prohibition, which still exists, on certain cannabis plants. So we're going to try to clarify what we're talking about here. And really what I find the most interesting, which is something that Ryan has really dug into, is where do we go with this industry and what are the opportunities, as we are really at this moment in history where I don't think I've ever seen the potential to craft regulation and to create an industry that we want, instead of 50 years down the line going, well, now we're trying to deal with the mess of legislation that we made back then. So Ryan, I know you first got into this because of your interest in water, and there was a particular water issue, and you're speaking to a Colorado crowd here again. Water is a big part of what we talk about. How did you first get interested in weed, cannabis?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I just want to start by thanking you all for being here. It's lovely to see you all, and it's been such a pleasure to be at this literary festival as well. As Maeve suggested, I first got into this topic, and I didn't know I would be here a few years later. But I was originally a water scholar studying water rights in Northern California, and I noticed there were increasing conflicts between cannabis farmers and the state Department of Water Resources. Typically, the state had been going after cannabis farmers because they were farming cannabis. But in recent years, increasingly, they've been going after cannabis farmers not because they're farming cannabis, but because they're making illegal water diversions, or using pesticides that are unregulated, doing other agricultural activities that have environmental impacts that aren't being permitted. And that was just a fascinating legal conundrum that I observed as the state was trying to figure out, all right, if these farmers are going to be legal and if we're going to give them permits, how do we also allow them to draw water in an agricultural system that doesn't have a whole lot of it? And from there, I think that it just became clear that there were so many issues facing the cannabis industry. And there are a lot of people studying it. But most people who are studying it, whether they're scholars or writers or policymakers, are often looking at it in terms of the retail experience or the consumer experience or public health or the medical side. But a lot of times the agricultural aspect of cannabis was getting lost. In some states, for example, the state of New York, when they legalized medical cannabis, the process of producing cannabis they called manufacturing, which was interesting since it's a plant that has to be grown. And so I think you still have that kind of mindset in a lot of places that this isn't necessarily an agricultural product, when of course it is, and we need to think about it in terms of its status as a crop and as a plant that has a role in our agricultural system.
Well, before we get too much into what lies ahead, let's look a little bit at the history of how we got to the point where this plant has been so vilified and so regulated and prohibited at a federal level that it's really creating this maze that needs to be navigated as more and more states are actually legalizing it. So what is the history of cannabis? And we'll talk about cannabis and hemp. Now, hemp is it's the plant that's almost identical to cannabis, but it doesn't have the THC, which is psychotropic, or psychoactive rather, component. Is that?
Yeah, that's a good synopsis, I think. They're both cannabis, but hempen strains are grown more for their industrial qualities, for their fibers, or for their seeds, whereas we might call a psychoactive marijuana those strains are grown more for their spiritual or psychoactive or recreational effects or benefits. So one of the first chapters in the book is called A Brief History of Marijuana Farming. It was maybe my favorite chapter to write because the history of cannabis is so fascinating. It goes back so far. Cannabis is one of humanity's oldest crops. It is in fact really difficult for ethnobotanists to study because it quickly became traded and grown all over the world. And so it's difficult to pinpoint precisely where it originated and where it is native. But people generally believe, or many scholars believe, that it originated in South Asia, perhaps in Central Asia, either in India or in Afghanistan. And that those plants were used and developed both for hempen purposes or industrial purposes to make things like textiles or ropes. There's also really good evidence, and increasingly so, that it was used recreationally or spiritually. Ancient burial mounds now being found that had cannabis that is being tested for having high THC content, which is the kind of psychoactive component of cannabis that often gives you a high. There's a rich history of cannabis cultivation really worldwide. From those origins, it proliferated, was used by many of the early empires, including the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire brought it to North and South America. And here in the United States, we were originally one of the largest producers of hemp. In fact, one of the conditions for folks who were settling in Jamestown was that they had to grow hemp and send it back to the British government. And so in a sense, the agreement to grow hemp predates the United States itself, at least from a white colonialist perspective. And that continued. It became kind of a flashpoint in the Revolutionary War, this need to simultaneously cultivate hemp, but then send it back to Britain, which nobody in the United States, America, really wanted to do. Around the 1930s was when we've experienced our kind of American prohibition. It really started here with the states. Ironically, it was the state of California. That was the first state to prohibit cannabis, and states quickly continued thereafter. And really this hit kind of a high point. I shouldn't say a high point. It hit sort of its nadir, if you will, in the early 1970s when Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which prohibited cannabis from being consumed or even researched in the United States. It classified it as what we refer to as a Schedule I substance, which means it has absolutely no medicinal, therapeutic, or spiritual value. And since then, it has remained on the Schedule I list, so it remains federally prohibited. Starting around the 1990s, states started to reverse that early trend in first decriminalizing possession of cannabis, and then legalizing medicinal cannabis use, and now increasingly recreational cannabis use. Today we have 32 states here in the US that have legalized medicinal or recreational cannabis. The majority of Americans live in a state in which cannabis is legal in some form. I am currently residing in Idaho, which was one of only 3 states that has maintained a complete prohibition on cannabis. So, subject of my book, not necessarily, doesn't necessarily receive the best audience in my current home state.
Well, that ongoing federal prohibition has led to so many issues for the legal cannabis industry. In states like Colorado, where both recreational and medicinal marijuana is allowed. And one of the examples is banking. Because of the federal insurance of banks, they can't take money from cannabis because it's federally prohibited. Now, there is a bill that will be discussed, actually, I think, in the upcoming week. There have been several efforts to pass legislation to allow that. But talk about how federal prohibition is still impacting legal commerce in states that have lifted that prohibition at a state level.
Wow, so many ways. With respect to banking, it's really fascinating that these large cannabis businesses really can't use the benefits of banking and are really trafficking in cold hard cash in many ways. In my book, I kind of profile the experience of a farmer that I'm very good friends with named Jack, or at least his name is Jack in the book. He recently told me he's had a pretty good year. This 2019 has been, the prices have gone up quite a bit in Northern California for cannabis, and so he has been trying to figure out, and I don't particularly feel sorry for him, but he's been trying to figure out where to put all of his cash. And he had purchased this gigantic, really industrious-looking safe And I said, do you put it in the safe? And he said, no, that's just for appearances. In case someone shows up, they'll take the safe, but all the cash is buried around the property. I said, well, what would happen if you passed away? I mean, God forbid. And he said, well, if I pass away, just keep digging. And he said, maybe I'll draw you a map someday. But he still hasn't done that. But I think that illustrates, kind of the challenges that a lot of people are feeling. He's received his permit from the state of California and from the county. So the state, the regulators overseeing him consider him to be in compliance, but he still can't use banking, which is a real problem. And my anecdote is kind of funny, but it really creates some public safety concerns as well. But the ways in which federal prohibition are still impacting the cannabis industry are myriad. One way that I think folks in Colorado have experienced this is in organic certifications. A lot of people who consume cannabis would also preferably like that cannabis to be organic. We've seen in the news lately a lot of stories about vaping products or THC products being far from organic. But organic is a federally regulated term. It is regulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They allow certain states to certify that products are organic, but because cannabis remains federally illegal, you can't use that USDA organic certification product, a process on cannabis products. So if you're seeing organic on your especially your psychoactive cannabis, you should be suspicious.
Well, given all of that, does that then make it easier for small farming operations to actually operate and exclude some of the larger corporations? Because if you're in a cash-only industry, I mean, you're not going to get a big corporation coming in to that realm. And also, I see so many parallels with the local food movement, where it's, if you want to know where your food comes from, go meet your farmer at the farmer's market. And so, does that make it easier for small farms, which is really the premise of your book, that the future could be in the small family farms? Does that make it easier for them because of this ongoing federal prohibition?
Yeah, it's a great insight. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was to counter this narrative that big marijuana takeover is inevitable in the cannabis space. So a few years ago, you started seeing news headlines like, big marijuana is here, or get ready for the big marijuana takeover. This idea that the large industries are going to essentially take over what is previously kind of a small-scale operation here in the United States when it comes to psychoactive cannabis production. And in some ways, we've seen that. Right around the publication of my book late last year, Corona, beer maker, made a $1 billion investment in a Canadian cannabis producer. Marlboro also made a very large capital infusion in a Canadian cannabis producer. So you're seeing big alcohol, big tobacco come into this space and try to scale up production. And really one of the reasons I wrote this book was to push against that and to say that that's not inevitable. And that there is a potential future in which you have kind of a craft industry of cannabis producers that are producing locally and sustainably and artisanally. And I don't necessarily argue that there won't be this kind of big marijuana model, but rather that perhaps something, what I call craft weed, can exist alongside of it. And so one of the reasons that I think that this is possible, and we could discuss some others today, but as Maeve mentions, ironically, federal prohibition may be helping further this process. Because federal prohibition prevents any one player from becoming too large, lest they attract the attention of Federal Department of Justice. You're seeing mostly relatively small-scale players in the marijuana industry in the United States. Additionally, even though the federal government has indicated that they are not going to make enforcement of federal cannabis laws a priority in states where it is legal, there's still certain areas that they do consider a priority for enforcement, and one of those areas is interstate commerce. What that means is for all of these 32 states that have legalized a medicinal or recreational market, that supply has to come from in-state. And so as opposed to a sort of more national market in which we might be getting all our cannabis from California and then exporting it throughout the rest of the country, every state now has their kind of domestic roster of cultivators. And once the federal prohibition is eventually lifted, I expect that those states are going to have an interest in protecting those relatively small-scale players from being taken over by larger farms that try to flood the market.
And some of the states as well have residency requirements before you can set up a cannabis business, right? You have to be resident within the state for a certain period of time, even though there are efforts at state legislatures to maybe overturn some of those requirements that would facilitate maybe out-of-state corporations coming in.
Yeah, that's been really controversial so far. So in the interest of promoting a kind of artisanal industry, some states have started taking steps to protect that. I mean, really, if that is an interest that we have, we're going to need the laws and regulations that govern the marijuana industry to start reflecting it. So the state of California, for example, imposed an acreage limit on licenses to cannabis farms. You could grow no more than 1 acre of cannabis canopy, or 2 acres in some cases, depending on the license. Now, that's still a lot of plant canopy that can produce a lot of psychoactive marijuana, but it's not a 10,000 acre farm. In other states, they've required a residency. They've had residency requirements, so you have to be in-state. You can't just have some out-of-state investor coming in and propping up the business. Massachusetts, we've seen an interesting licensing scheme in which they give priority to artisanal producers for certain licenses. They also give priority to what they refer to as justice applicants, or applicants that are coming from communities that were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. That way they're ensuring that at least some of those communities get to share in the benefits of legalization. Now we're starting to see a little bit of rollback on some of those initial efforts to try to keep the industry small and local. In California, they're going to start issuing licenses starting in 2022 that do not have an acreage limit. In Washington State, they lifted the residency requirement, allegedly to start competing with California, even though that doesn't legally make a lot of sense since there shouldn't be any interstate commerce. But how we sort of fare in the next few years in terms of these specific regulations and policies will help determine whether or not the future is, just a few large farms represented by this idea of big marijuana, or if we're going to have, kind of small scale, hopefully sustainable cannabis farms all over the country.
Do you see we're at a tipping point now? Because I think, is it 32 states have some form of legal cannabis, whether it's medicinal or recreational? I mean, that's more states than have an ongoing prohibition. I mean, at what point are we going to just see the federal prohibition being lifted?
So many people try to predict that, and it's very difficult. I would be surprised if it happened in this current federal executive administration. They have indicated, it doesn't appear that enforcement of the Controlled Substances Act is a very high priority for this administration. But I would be surprised if we saw an amendment to the Controlled Substances Act that would remove cannabis. But every couple months there's a new bill that would suggest as much. You mentioned this bill that was introduced in the House this week, with respect to banking, that would allow cannabis businesses that are state legal to use the banking system. So I don't know if we're going to have this dramatic end of federal prohibition in the next year or two, but starting to chip away at it at the federal level, I think, is something that we can expect.
But on the most recent farm bill also allowed the cultivation of hemp everywhere. I mean, if and when, a lot of people just say it's a matter of when federal prohibition is lifted, will that be a game changer? I mean, is that when we're going to see corporations going, okay, now we can come in and take over?
Oh, absolutely. And that's another reason why I think it's so important for states to start thinking about what type of industry they want, and for consumers to start thinking about what kind of industry they want now. Again, it's kind of this ironic advantage that we have, in a way, to see state legalization at the same time that the federal government is maintaining federal prohibition, because states are getting to dabble in their approach to regulating the industry. States often described as laboratories of democracy, and there's no better example for that than the cannabis industry. While at the same time, once the federal prohibition is lifted, I think it's really hard to predict what will happen at that point.
We mentioned Corona and Marlboro, beer company, tobacco company, major investments in the cannabis industry in Canada. That would seem to me to be part of, say, the recreational marijuana industry. But a lot of people are concerned about big pharma because we're seeing CBD, cannabidiol, which is the medicinal component of the cannabis plant. And there are many, many strains of all of this. I know we're talking about it maybe in oversimplistic terms. But when we're seeing the proliferation of CBD, I mean, you just walk around any store on the Pearl Street Mall in Boulder, you'll see CBD in chocolate, CBD in this. It's, a cure for whatever ails you. Are we going to see, or are we already seeing big pharma now really paying attention to the medicinal aspect of the cannabis plant?
I think investments are coming from everywhere. Big alcohol, big tobacco, big pharma has certainly shown some interest. Silicon Valley getting involved in the cannabis industry in the ways that we perhaps deliver cannabis to consumers. Wall Street now offering certain investment products in cannabis stocks. You can invest in a mutual fund or an index fund that tracks the cannabis market specifically. So I think if there is the sort of big marijuana takeover, it can come from any number of different places, which is, again, another reason to think about if that's something we want. With respect to CBD, which again is not sort of psychoactive, or at least less psychoactive than your strains that are high in THC, I think there's a lot of potential in that, both medicinally and perhaps there's some areas there for compromise in terms of this big marijuana versus small marijuana idea. One of the last chapters in my book, I call small marijuana, big hemp. And I suggest that perhaps the hemp industry is an area where larger scale production may make some sense. With respect to marijuana, I think, a lot of times still consumption is still dominated by consuming the raw flower, in which case the quality is still really, really important. Whereas with hemp, you're often deriving secondary products or derivative products. And so large scale production might be a little bit more sensical in that regard. And I have a really good friend here in Boulder who is working for a CBD company, and they are being very thoughtful about their sourcing and about their products, and seeing that market is moving very rapidly and trying to think about how they can fill those gaps.
Well, just in terms of that issue of quality and quality control, I mean, this gets back to what you mentioned earlier with the organics labeling, the fact that federal prohibition means that you can't actually have an official organic label on a cannabis product. What about quality control labeling? And this really gets into a part of the book that you really delve into, and the fact that we could create a system where people can be assured of the quality of the cannabis they're going to be purchasing. Much the same way that, say, vintners and so the wine industry has a particular label that if something's grown in a particular region, it has that certain quality assured. Talk a little bit about your work in California on that and where that might be going as an industry.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So one thing I've proposed is a marijuana appellation system. So you're probably familiar with appellations. When you purchase a bottle of wine and it says Napa Valley on it, you can be assured that it really did come from Napa Valley because a government regulator is certifying that designation of origin. And that's called an appellation system. And we have them for not only wine, but other agricultural products, like cheese, cured meats, olive oils, and the like. The benefit to an appellation system is that it helps keep the market, especially the agricultural producers, diversified. It essentially differentiates a Napa Valley red wine from a Burgundy red wine. They're now two different products. You can't flood the market with one and try to eliminate other producers. And for consumers, it creates a market in which you have more choice. You have hundreds, thousands of different wine regions all over the world that you get to choose from, and that makes it a little bit more interesting. I've advocated for using an appellation system for cannabis production. The idea would be that you would kind of prevent this commoditization of cannabis. You couldn't just flood the market with one generic cannabis product because there is no generic cannabis product. Instead, you would see different regions protected and their designations of origin certified. So for example, if cannabis came from Humboldt County, California, you could sell it as Humboldt County, California cannabis, and somebody, a government agency, would be certifying that that's really true. Now there's kind of two different approaches to appellations that we see worldwide. In the wine industry, you can compare and contrast the American system versus the French system. So in the American system, we only certify geographic origin. So if you see that, again, your wine comes from Napa Valley, all that we're saying is that it came from Napa Valley. We're not certifying that it's a particular type of grape or that it was harvested using a certain technique or that it meets any type of quality standards. We just say that it comes from Napa Valley. In France, the system is a little bit different. If it comes from a certain appellation, that appellation likely has many different regulations or requirements on its producers. So for example, you can only use certain grape varietals, or they might be checking variety, or they might be checking to make sure that you're using artisanal methods. So one question that has come up in trying to determine if appellations would be a good idea for cannabis is whether or not we should follow the American model or the French model. And over the past year, I participated, well, let me back up, just to give you context on this idea. I wrote an article about this online, a news website, I think in 2016, and I wasn't the first person to come up with this idea, but I was trying to popularize it at the time, and some online commenter essentially said, "Ryan Stoa, you're full of shit. This idea will never take off." Fast forward a couple years, over the past year, the California Department of Agriculture has been putting together a working group to try to figure out how to set up an appellation system for cannabis. It was an honor for me to be part of that working group, and now they've sort of launched public forums to solicit public feedback on how such an appellation system would work in California. So it appears that that is an idea that's taking root, so to speak, and moving forward. And so far, indications are that the preference is for those appellations to not only certify origin, but also perhaps sustainability standards, quality standards, and production standards. So we'll see if that really comes to fruition in California and elsewhere, but it looks promising for now.
Well, one of the things I'd like to talk about is, as we are just now starting a whole new agricultural industry and this new crop that was just vilified and outlawed for so many years, the lack of seeds that were actually available. I know this was a big issue for hemp farmers who had to apply for a special license from the Colorado Department of Agriculture to get a license to grow hemp. They had all the regulatory hurdles to get through, but then they were like, where do we get the seeds from? Because the seeds did not exist because of what had happened to the crop, and there were efforts then to import the seeds from other countries, and there were all kinds of stories coming out like seeds being impounded at various different ports. This happened in Kentucky, I think, a batch of seeds from Italy. So talk a little bit about that, and because there are so many parallels to me with the food industry, and there's such a concept now about preserving seeds and the purity of food and heirloom varieties. I mean, right here in the Boulder Public Library, there's a seed library with seeds that are very specific to this region for various different vegetables. So talk a little bit about that and the challenges facing the industry to even just get the seeds to start crops.
So, it's a great question, and it's really one of the sad aspects of federal prohibition is that we lost that seed bank for hempen strains. A lot of times we think about cannabis as either psychoactive marijuana or non-psychoactive hemp, but really there's hundreds, thousands of strains of each. And any particular strain might do better in certain growing conditions than others. And in the early 1900s, the U.S. was still a hemp-producing powerhouse, and we were growing hemp all over the country. And those strains and those seeds pertained to a particular growing region and the growing methods in that region. And with federal prohibition, we really lost a lot of those seeds. And so we now sort of have to start over and try to figure out which strains of hemp grow best in which growing regions. So we've been importing some of those seeds, some from Canada, as you mentioned, some from Europe, and that's created some customs issues as we sort of grapple with federal prohibition again. But that's something that farmers are going to have to think deeply about. Interestingly, that process kind of got supercharged in the marijuana space, or in psychoactive strains, starting in the 1970s. as cultivators started breeding plants together, melding cannabis sativas and cannabis indicas together. Cannabis is such a fascinating plant for so many reasons, one of which is that plants are either male or female, which is uncommon in the plant kingdom. And so because of that, you can take a male from one strain and a female from another strain and breed them together and create a hybrid. And you can take that hybrid and breed it with another hybrid. And this process is relatively easy, meaning that individual farmers or cultivators can come up with their own very unique strains. And here again, we're seeing the industry try to find its way through the dark and try to figure out what the best way is to identify which strains are best. You talk about seeds and trying to figure out which seeds we should be using in the cannabis industry. Some farmers are trying to figure out if we should be using seeds at all. A lot of marijuana cultivators have been moving to clones. So one thing you can do with the cannabis plant as well is cut off a branch, put it in a soil medium, and it'll grow up to be a genetically identical version of that mother plant. And that's extremely valuable for a cultivator because you can take sort of a mother plant and take all the clippings and develop 60 plants from that mother plant, and they're all going to produce buds or cannabis that's genetically identical, which is really important when you're trying to sell it. You take it to a dispensary, and now you've got really consistent product. Seeds, on the other hand, you grow 60 different plants, you're going to get 60 different products. You're going to get 60 different outcomes. And how farmers kind of navigate the pros and cons of that approach will be a really interesting aspect of the future of the industry. The downside to clones, you get consistency, but you trade off kind of the vigorousness or the vigor of those plants. They're essentially mature plants as soon as you put them in the ground. If you take a clipping from a clone and you raise that and you do that every year for 10 years, that 10th year when you take that clipping and put it in the ground, it's not a new seedling, it's a 10-year-old plant. And so they tend to get weak and produce a lower yield. So these are really tough questions for cultivators, and not least of which is where do we get the seeds and which ones are most appropriate for our region.
Well, getting back to this idea that there's maybe a specter, a corporate bogeyman that's waiting in the wings to come in and take over this industry, just hearing you talk about that, I think of Monsanto, I think of GMO, and their patenting of seeds when it comes to food production, and what's happened in the corporate and the commodified and industrial food system because of those kind of corporations. I mean, is that a genuine concern for cannabis?
Oh, it's absolutely a concern, and a lot of people are afraid of that future. What's interesting about federal prohibition is that the federal government is really large, and there are many different agencies that regulate certain aspects of the cannabis industry, or that would regulate it if it were legal. And those agencies don't necessarily take a consistent view. So the USDA, for example, is not really talking to states much about how to regulate pesticides or how to certify organic products. But other agencies have been a little bit more willing to kind of jump into the fray. And one of those agencies is the US Patent and Trade Office. They have been issuing utility patents, really broad patents, for strains of plants, of cannabis plants, for decades. And typically those were not psychoactive, but starting a few years ago, they issued their first patent for a psychoactive strain of cannabis. And so this woke everybody up and said, whoa, hold on, if people are going to start issuing patents or start receiving patents for cannabis, does that mean we're essentially going to have a Monsanto situation where all the strains we know and love now their intellectual property rights are owned by someone else. Normally, you can't receive a patent if the product you're trying to patent is open and obvious or has been on the market for a year or more. So a lot of the strains that we know have been around for decades. But could you make an argument if you're applying for a patent that these products haven't been on the market, they've been on the illicit market? And once federal prohibition is lifted, well, I was the first one who applied for a utility patent for this cannabis strain that everybody uses, and it hasn't been on the legal market for a year. That, I think, is what a lot of people are worried about. there was a GQ article a couple of years back called "The Great Pot Monopoly Mystery," and it kind of chronicled this kind of shadowy organization that was trying to apply for dozens of these type of patents in order to essentially own the IP rights over the entire cannabis industry. In response to that, there's been a group, I think they're called the Open Cannabis Project, that has been taking in strains from different cultivators and trying to document and chronicle and put into a database their DNA. That way, if anybody applies for a patent, you could say, well, hold on, we actually put the DNA for that specific strain in our database 3 years ago, so it can't be open, it can't be something that you derived yourself. Who ends up winning that kind of tension may really help shape whether or not this turns into an IP war in the cannabis industry, or if it remains kind of this open source industry that it's been for the last couple decades.
Well, the premise of your book, Craft Weed, you're very optimistic that there is a future for small scale farming that can really regenerate rural America, because we're seeing the loss of farmland because we're not seeing the next generation coming in. It's such a hard industry to be in. Here in Colorado, we are actually seeing hemp cultivation attracting a new generation of farmers. I mean, talk a little bit about that, about how this could actually just benefit rural America, or just America in general, because of the potential to bring a whole new generation of farmers into the fold.
Yeah, I think it's got enormous potential. Folks have been, in the cannabis space talking about an agrarian renaissance. Especially when you couple it with this Appellations idea that would, create or protect rural economies from competition outside of those jurisdictions. I think there's enormous potential there. I tell an anecdote in, I think, the last chapter of my book of a cannabis farmer going to kind of a farmers association in the state of Washington. Most were growing wheat or hops, and they sort of reported on their cannabis statistics, including the revenue generated per acre. And when they revealed these stats, you could hear a pin drop in the room. These were folks that have been growing wheat arduously over many years, and cannabis is coming in and producing revenues that were just staggering. And so, in a way, it's not just that it's bringing new farmers into agriculture, but I think existing farmers now are also starting to experiment with cannabis, and you see them using that as part of their crop portfolio. Whether it's hemp as a rotation crop or psychoactive cannabis sort of supplement their incomes. I think cannabis requires very specialized skills, but at the end of the day, it's an agricultural activity, and a lot of people that have been farmers for many years are now taking a second look at cannabis and thinking about whether or not that's something that they might want to get into.
But we started the conversation talking about your background in water and how that really got you into looking at cannabis. And of course, water is such a huge issue here in Colorado. We don't have enough for everybody who needs it. And agriculture uses 80% of the water, even upwards of that, arguably, here in the state of Colorado. And there's a lot of concern about, well, are they using the most efficient irrigation practices? And then maybe could we have more drought-tolerant crops that need less water? Hemp is being put out there as the wonder crop. There's now some skepticism as to whether or not it's as drought resistant as maybe some of the proponents say it is. But I think one of the nuances as part of that is that we're seeing a new generation of hemp farmers coming in who are willing to embrace new irrigation practices, new technology that can arguably make it more drought resistant because of how it's being farmed. Do you know what I mean? So that the crop in and of itself might not necessarily need less water, but they're using new farming practices that actually allow them to use less water.
Yeah, it's, I'm a little bit biased because I started my career in water law, but I think it's a fascinating case study of the types of issues that the cannabis industry is facing and the ways in which regulators are having a hard time trying to figure out how to help the industry, not only survive but thrive. One of the reasons a couple of years ago in 2015, you started seeing news headlines in which the cannabis industry was really getting criticized for its unsustainable impacts. One that I recall was, it looks like your green isn't so green after all. Or marijuana is sucking rivers dry. Cannabis farmers are getting blamed for sort of dwindling numbers of coho salmon in Northern California, and all these other types of issues. And a lot of it came back to a study that was done by the Department of Fish and Wildlife in the state of California. And the study essentially took satellite imagery of all the cannabis plants that they found in a particular watershed. And they multiplied that number of plants by 6 gallons of water per plant per day during the growing season. And then they compared that with flows of rivers and tributaries to determine if there was enough water to support this industry in this agricultural practice. And they found that in almost every case, there was not even close to enough water, that in fact rivers were actually running dry by these calculations. So this led to all these news stories about the environmentally damaging impacts. The problem with that study, and this was, to be fair, acknowledged by the authors, they said in a footnote, we're assuming 6 gallons of water per plant per day, but where does that number come from? They traced it back to a pamphlet that had been produced by a growers association in Humboldt County. I talked to the director of that organization to say, where did that number come from? And he said, we really have no idea, but we certainly didn't intend it for it to be used in any governmental or official capacity. There's a lot of evidence that plants don't take nearly that much water, or that they could, but maybe only in September or October when they're these fully mature plants. And it really depends on the strain, on the time of the growing season, on the farmer himself or herself, and how they choose to cultivate. So there's still, I think that's a great example of the uncertainty that we face in the cannabis industry. We still don't know how much water each plant takes per day, and it's highly variable. To suggest that we do know that is a little bit naive. But I think that water issue is really critical, and I don't envy the regulators that have to find their way through this. In states like Colorado or California, where you kind of use this priority system, essentially all these cultivators are coming into the legal market, which means they're last in priority. So are you going to put all cannabis farmers at the back of the line when it comes to water? If so, then you might see a lot of them stay on the illicit market.
And very often water rights are more expensive than the land itself, and farmers are selling water rights as opposed to the land because that's where the money is. But before we start taking questions, you're in Colorado, which is really at the forefront. Many people have certainly back 2014 was at the forefront of recreational industry, and of course we had a medicinal industry before that. Every year the state legislature is looking at laws and new regulations. How do we regulate this industry? So for just a general audience, people not necessarily involved in the industry, but people living in a state where this industry is now emerging, what do you want the message of your book to be? And what do you want people here, particularly in Colorado, to really know and to pay attention to?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I love the question. I sort of close my book by pointing out that this is an unprecedented moment in history. We have $1 billion agricultural industry that's coming into the legal market for the first time, really. I mean, cannabis used to be legal in the early 1900s, but not in any way close to the shape and form that it's in right now. So all these agencies across the country, state or federal or local, all these government officials are regulating this massive and rapidly evolving industry for the first time. And they don't have all the answers. In many cases, they're begging for help. So I sort of say to readers and to you all, why not give it to them? This is a really unique opportunity and moment where states are trying to develop expertise, and in the meantime, really soliciting a lot of feedback from the public and from stakeholders. So I think that consumers can really impact that by making certain market choices, but also participating in some of these public forums and public meetings and trying to shape that legislation. We like to criticize or at least some people like to criticize the agricultural system in the United States for not representing our kind of modern food movement ideals. And we all also, I think, simultaneously recognize how difficult that is to change because that system is the status quo. Whereas in the cannabis industry, there really isn't a status quo. And if you were to characterize the status quo, it would currently be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of small farms. There's an estimated 67,000 cannabis farms in the state of California alone. Compare that to 3,000 wineries in that state, right? So we're not talking about having to change the system. We're talking about creating the system. And I think that's such a unique opportunity that we have to do that and to try to create an agricultural regulatory framework, if you will, for this particular crop that reflects what we consider the public interest. And we can have a lot of debates about what the public interest really is and what that means, but at least we have that opportunity.
Well, I think we have opportunity if people have questions.
Yes, we have about 15 minutes, so if you would like to ask a question, raise your hand. I saw this gentleman in the hat first, so if you will bring you the microphone, don't worry about switching it on or off because it's all done in the booth, okay? And also just try to ask a question. If you want to share anything with Ryan, afterwards would be better. Will you be signing your book?
Yes, I'll be signing downstairs.
Okay, so if you have something that's fairly long and involved or whatever, if you could save it to after. Sorry, I'm being editorial. Okay, please.
Okay, so that's not working.
Hang on, so, no, don't switch any of the things. They just need to see you. I think it's number 2. Okay.
So you mentioned something a minute ago about the public interest. It does say dead battery on it.
Oh, okay. Well, we can hear you, and we'll let
I can hear you, and we can repeat the question.
What do you think about the illegal marijuana market in states that have developed all the administrative procedures, regulations, and so forth that you talked about? Because as you probably know, there have been some articles written in the past year about how everything has changed in many places, and some people like the good old days of buying pot on the streets and so on and so forth, and think that it's sort of unfair or bad to try to make it illegal in the sense of making it impossible for people who don't want to fit into the regulatory scheme that you're talking about. And many of those are the smallest of the small farmers, I think. And I'm curious your thoughts about if we're maintaining some non-big-scale corporate people and we're supporting the 67,000 marijuana farms, are there another 30,000 that are not on the books anywhere? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, astute observation. I got a couple different ways I'm going to answer that. And first of all, just to clarify that those 67,000 farms are not all licensed. So that's there's probably a lot of unlicensed farms there. But that's been a central debate when I talk to farmers. That the common debate, when they're all kind of hanging out and talking shop is, whether or not to go legal. And a lot of them, just kind of look at the regulatory landscape and say, man, it's really not worth it. There's still a thriving illicit market, and the prices are still really high. And what I think a lot of farmers are frustrated by is, and I've talked to a couple farmers that genuinely, really want to go legal, so to speak. But they're relatively small-scale operations, and every agency in the state wants a little piece of the pie. So they can handle, one agency or a centralized agency asking for, a $2,000 application fee. But if there's 6 different agencies asking for a $2,000 application fee, that becomes too onerous. There's too many regulations.
Yeah,
I was at a conference in Washington State earlier this year in which one of the cannabis regulators who formerly worked for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the federal agency that regulates nuclear energy production. Nuclear is considered by many to be the most highly regulated industry in the United States. And he said, well, now it's number 2 because cannabis is number 1. And so I think that's preventing, unfortunately, a lot of earnest farmers that would like to go legal from doing so. As far as market consumers go, I think you correctly point out that a lot of people, whether or not they still prefer the romantic charm of buying it on the street or not, I think the prices are still lower in a lot of cases. And I think that was a big problem for Colorado in the early years of legalization. The taxes were so high that I think I read one study that almost 50% or over 50% of consumers were still buying it on the illicit market. And then you had sort of this graduated taxing scheme in which recreational cannabis was taxed higher than medical cannabis. And so some people were still trying to purchase through the medical avenue. And so I think it's on states in a way to try to figure this out. And they can't just tax the hell out of it and expect people not to seek a solution on the illicit market. So they have to find that balance of encouraging and allowing cultivators to get into the legal market while also finding a way to bring it to market and bring it to consumers in a way that'll disincentivize people from seeking out illicit market products. And I'll close my response to your question by citing Keith Stroup, who was the founder of NORML, the National Organization for the Repeal of Marijuana Laws. And I talked to him for this book, and he said, look, end of the day, one thing that I think a lot of people should be fighting for is in states where they're legalizing, still allowing individuals to cultivate at home. Because that's kind of our safety valve. No matter what the legal market looks like or the illicit market looks like, if they're just churning out really expensive or really low quality products, at least you can still grow at home. And unfortunately, what you're seeing is that a lot of states are legalizing either medicinal or recreational use, but prohibiting at-home cultivation. So I think that's still an important piece of the puzzle, is still allowing people to grow one or two plants if they really choose to do so.
Okay, hands, please. Oh, goodness. You were just the first. You just run it up the way. Okay, did that. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
So I heard that a lot of the money that was supposed to go to the schools never really made it to the students in Colorado. Is that true?
Well, just to clarify, Amendment 64 designated that the taxation was going to school infrastructure. So I think there was a lot of misconception that people thought this will solve all the problem with education funding. It was specific school infrastructure products that was written into the law. And there have been massive investments in school infrastructure, particularly in western parts of Colorado. So just to clarify, because a lot of people thought, why are we having education funding issues when we've got all this pot money? It was specifically designated for school infrastructure as part of the law.
Bring the microphone over to this gentleman, and here, and Duncan has a question too. So you can go first. I think you get the.
We hear,
Okay, go ahead.
This is number one.
we hear that hemp can make many products that now we use petroleum for instead. And I know there's a hemp processing factory going to be built west of Greeley fairly soon. What can you say about that as an alternative to using petroleum oil products?
Well, there's a lot of potential there. I mean, as you mentioned, hemp can be used for a number of different products. Whether it's consumer goods, energy, in your case, textiles, food, nut milk, seed milk, for example. I think one challenge for the hemp industry, it's still pretty challenging to cultivate and to draw out a lot of those products. It's still a very labor-intensive industry, and we haven't yet had that technological breakthrough to take those really, really tough fibers and convert that into energy in a particularly efficient way. I think there's a lot of potential. I'm not an expert in energy transfer in that regard, but I think if there was a technological breakthrough there that would make it a little bit less labor intensive, you might see hemp even more prolifically in the marketplace than you do now.
Just want to go back to Maeve's earlier question about hemp and CBD. What do you think, just leaving the cannabis complexities aside, and I don't know your book, but is there a way we can see how hemp as healing medicine, especially it's becoming very popular for pain. How would that emerge here? Would it have to emerge with a large corporation in terms of these difficulties you're talking about with hemp cultivation and labor intensiveness? And if so, does that make it more vulnerable to being co-opted by the big pharma? And what kind of influences can we as people kind of call for in our legislature to try to protect small hemp small hemp production, but also reliable, and it won't be taken over and inflated prices by big pharma?
Yeah, so let me back up, because I think we talk about in the cannabis industry a lot of times two cannabinoids, THC or CBD, THC being kind of our psychoactive compound, and CBD the more therapeutic compound. But those are just two of what may be hundreds of different compounds in the cannabis plant that we know very little about. And so one of the exciting features of a legal marijuana industry or cannabis industry would be doing more research on all those compounds to try to draw out what they're providing to us. There's an interesting database called leafly.com that has a lot of those strains and varieties, and you could filter them according to whatever it is you're looking for. So if you're looking for a strain that would help you for migraines, for example, it'll give you a lot of the strains that users indicate is really helpful for migraines. Unfortunately, we don't always know exactly why it is that that strain is really helpful for migraines. So trying to tease that out may be a really exciting breakthrough for the industry. As far as your question in terms of CBD or other compounds, I think some have argued that there's maybe more potential for big marijuana to take over the sort of extracts industries, whether that's oils or edibles or that kind of thing, because you're kind of a step removed from the actual raw flower, where you might be more likely to notice differences in quality. And I think that's a little bit overblown. If you think about the alcohol analogy, there's a reason, So in cannabis, I think there's kind of this race to get to the highest possible THC content. Let's see how high we can get. And compare this to alcohol, I think there's a reason that not many people drink 90% alcoholic beverages, right? Like, we're not all drinking like moonshine and Everclear, right? Well, why is that? Because when it's just alcohol, you're taking away a lot of those other compounds that contribute to taste and to what we perceive of as quality. And I think the same will be true for cannabis products as you sort of try to go higher and higher and higher on THC or CBD. I think you're losing some of those other compounds that we don't know a lot about yet. And so I think that there's still going to be that potential to keep quality high, even in extracts like oils or edibles.
I think we are we out of time? Do we have time for one more?
If somebody has a
Quick.
question,
And mine will be signing books. And
is it a quick question? Yeah. Okay, hang on, we'll just bring you a microphone, then everybody can hear you.
I was wondering whether there could be a scenario where the market is flooded with too much cannabis, and if so, what would be the repercussions?
Definitely, it's already happened. Last summer, I believe it was, or 2018, the state of Oregon was flooded. There was so much production, and because of the federal prohibition, they couldn't export it out of state, so prices really plummeted, and a lot of people went out of business. In fact, I've been tracking a little bit more closely the prices for cultivators in Northern California. And in 2017, prices really hit rock bottom, really in response to state legalization that November 2016. So a lot of people jumped into the market and started producing, and there was a lot of product, and a lot of farmers went out of business because prices weren't as high as they were expecting. Since then, it's rebounded quite a bit. That summer, I think you saw prices for AAA buds, or the highest quality cannabis, were around $700 or $800 a pound. This summer, you're seeing them closer to $1,300 or $1,400. So I think you have seen some of those shocks. In Oregon, especially, there was such an oversupply that you could get it for dirt cheap, and that was a real problem. And I think regulators kind of thought, well, maybe we licensed a few too many people. Ultimately, there's nothing that state regulators can do about the federal prohibition. I suspect many people turned to the illicit market and tried to export in more illegal ways. But certainly we have seen those prices hit rock bottom. And that's really one of the concerns about kind of this big marijuana takeover, is there's going to be one 10,000 acre farm that produces dirt cheap generic cannabis, floods the market, and everybody goes out of business. And my book, in essence, is trying to think about ways in which that may not come to fruition, and how we might want to think about the industry if we want an outcome that doesn't resemble that. So I want to thank all of you for attending. I thank Maeve for being such a delightful host, and thank you very much for coming out.